Hello and welcome to this video where I'm going to be painting a Grimdark Ultramarine. I am going to be using an airbrush and some oil weathering as well, but I'm going to try and keep it as simple as possible and talk you through it as I go along. To start with though, we're just going to be adding some colour and texture to the model, again very simple, and using Macragge blue from Games Workshop, and I'm using a small Archsobus dry brush. And you can see here I apply a good amount of paint to the tip of the brush and then just kind of scrunch it on some kitchen roll, and then it's just a case of stippling it all over. Now this isn't dry brushing, and we're not looking to pick out all the edges and things. We just want to get colour onto the model. The reason I'm doing this is, one, it's quite a quick process. You can cover the whole model very rapidly, but also it's going to add a certain amount of texture to the model, which will work really nicely for the weathering effect at the end. It will be a case that while you're applying this and up until the very final stages of the process, that it looks quite kind of messy and rough. So you have to kind of trust the process and just accept that through all the stages that you're working through, it's not going to look amazing until right at the very end when you finish the piece and put it on the base. But here you can see it. So I'm just aiming to make sure that all the armor panels are caught. If you can, try and avoid things like the bolt gun and the chainsword, because those aren't going to be blue. But it's not a big deal if you do catch it, because all you just have to do is use some black paint and touch it up afterwards. So the main thing is to make an effort to cover the panels. And if it is a case that you're catching the bolt gun, it's better to catch the bolt gun if you are getting to the paint into the kind of more recessed areas. So ultimately aim to cover the panels, and it's a fairly quick and simple thing to do, really. The nice thing about this as well is that it will kind of give a little bit of shape and definition to the armor panels. So some of them have curves and things on. You can see there on the hip plate, so it almost sort of highlights it. There you can see it, as I said, it looks a bit rough. You can see the Grimdark element already coming through. Make sure you get the model all the way around. I do have to point out, if you are someone that doesn't care too much about mold lines, the techniques that I'm using here, they will kind of highlight them a bit. I mean, if you don't mind about how they look, that's fine. But just be aware that the brushes and the airbrush and all the weathering that we're going to do, they will kind of emphasize them a little bit. So now we're using the airbrush. I'm going to try and keep it as simple as possible. And all it is running Calgar blue. I've mixed it with a little bit of airbrush thinner and water. And all you're doing is looking for the highlight spots on the model that you want to pick out. So normally these would be the shoulders and head, possibly the chest and the kind of the top of the backpack, and then any other parts on the model that you think might look interesting to stand out. Do you want to keep this kind of as a less is more sort of thing? So if you start highlighting everything, one, you're going to end up with a baby blue looking marine. So the more of this you use, the less of the dark Macragge blue is going to be visible. And really you just trying to do this to get the focal point. So as I said, the shoulders and the head, and obviously these legs forward a little bit, so that is a good point to catch as well. And then it's exactly the same process again with the blue horror. I think these are the same colours that Games Workshop uses when they're painting marines, so you should end up with something that's quite similar. The only thing is, because the way they paint is very much edge highlight focused, on the highlighted parts on this, because we're using light volumes with the highlights with the airbrush, these are going to look a lot lighter than on a Games Workshop model, but generally speaking, it'll balance out around about the same. For the airbrush, I'm using a size 0.4mm needle, so you don't need some really fine and delicate needle for this kind of work. As I said, it's very simple, and straightforward. It's just like a little quick squirt on the highlight areas that you want. Now to move on to the golden trim. I'm using scale 75 Dwarven gold. On hindsight, or in hindsight rather, I'd probably pick a different colour, or at least I'd give it multiple coats. I did discover that this doesn't have great coverage. I usually use Victorian Brass from Scale 75, which has fantastic coverage, but it wasn't quite bright enough for what I wanted, and this has got a really nice colour to it. But as you can see, it's not covering in one coat, and yeah, so basically, if you want a really nice finish to your metallics when doing this, either if you want to use the Dwarven Gold, then make sure you do multiple coats, or pick a different gold that has better coverage. You can see here more clearly on the chest eagle that it very much runs into the recesses and doesn't settle very much on the edges. I wasn't too bothered about it though. It just makes it look a little bit worn, but yeah, for reference, do multiple coats. You can also see as well that so this isn't watered down. This was just straight out of the squeezy bottle, and it runs. It's very fluid. So you can see there when I touched the joint near the skull and the wing, and it ran into the recess there. They are very sort of fluid, so you probably will need to go back with a bit of black paint just to fix any of those bits where it's run into the creases. So now all I'm going to do is just use some black paint to fix up any of the areas on the model where I didn't want any of the blue to catch. And at the same time, while you're doing this, you can fix any of those areas where the gold has also gone into recesses. I must say, when you paint on the gold, be really careful if you can not to get any on the areas that you've highlighted with the airbrush, because those are much harder to fix, and it's more likely to be a case that if you get gold on those parts, it's better to turn it into some sort of chip or some maybe oil streaking later on just to go over the top of it, because it'll be hard to kind of colour match on top of airbrush work. Also at this stage you can fill in the eyes, and you'll probably, it's, if you have the paint a little bit more watered down than maybe you normally would, it'll flow into the recesses in the eye socket quite nicely, so you don't have to be as neat as you may expect. Also, now I'm going to be painting any of the kind of the steel looking metallics. I think it was Magnesium from Vallejo that I'm using. It doesn't matter too much which metallic colour you use for this. I particularly do like the Vallejo metallics for how fluid and how well they cover. I would have liked to have used a Vallejo gold for the trim, but they, as far as I saw from these particular ones, the metal colour ones in the big pots, they didn't have anything that was sort of very golden. Like they do have a gold that I use, but it's a very bright and shiny gold, and almost kind of chrome in how it looks with how shiny it is. And you'll actually see me use some of that a little bit later on the shoulder pads as a highlight. So there wasn't anything that was kind of like that darker colour that I wanted. Got a little bit of a bubble there on the barrel that I drilled out. Also, when you're painting all these metallic parts on, you don't have to spend too long doing this. So there are parts on the model that are quite hard to reach with a brush, and if it's in a fairly dark area, just leave it. This is just for tabletop gaming. There's no point in spending hours and hours on something that you can hardly see when you're looking at it up close. If you can't see it when you're looking at it up close, then when you've got the model on the tabletop, you're not going to be able to see it at all. It's just a waste of time spending all that effort on trying to paint something that's really hard to reach with your brush. Now we're going to be painting the bolt gun and the chainsaw. This is just a really quick way of getting a bit of light and definition on there. I'm painting the flat surfaces as light grey, just at the upwards facing ones. It'll give a bit of contrast so you can see the difference between the side and the top of the gun. If you want, you can just edge highlight it as well, but if you do that, it will kind of be a little bit jarring in contrast to the style of the painting on the armour, because obviously there are light volumes on there. So it is kind of useful to just do a little bit of highlighting on the flat surfaces of the gun, but just don't go crazy doing it. Part of my problem, actually, I find when painting or trying to paint tabletop stuff is that because I enjoy painting and I always want to try and paint things for display level, it's stopping myself from painting the model too much, and just leaving it where it's already good enough. It doesn't need that final stage of polishing, and usually what I end up doing when I want to do something quick is forcing myself to stop painting on all the kind of extra unimportant parts of the model, and if I do need to spend a bit of time on it just because to give it that little bit of something extra, then I'll just focus more on the head and the sort of chest and shoulder area, because again those are the focal points, those are the bits that people will always look at first, whereas things like the feet and parts of the back of the model, things like that, they're not really that interesting and people don't pay much attention to it. A lot of the times actually when I show whips of display level pieces, I was like, it still needs a lot of work or whatever, it's not quite finished, and people quite often comment, oh, it looks finished to me, what have you got left to do? And the reason they're saying that is because when you look at the focal point, I've already done it. So I'll usually done the head and chest areas on models, and it'd be things like the backpacks in the background of the photo, they'd just be black, and to me I'm like, well, it's quite obvious that the backpack's not painted, but people are just looking at the focal points on the model and those are already done, and so they kind of assume the model's finished. So here you can see I'm just going to add a little bit of sort of scratchy texture to this. Ideally I wanted to spend more time, like I was kind of already itching at this stage to sort of put some fine detail and transition onto the gun, but I forced myself to stop. Just some very simple sort of scratchy marks on there. They work as a transition as well, and it's actually quite nice to do these scratchy marks for transitions because it means you get a much quicker process. You don't have to get a very smooth transition. Just having the scratches set further apart helped to give the impression that it's a transition on there just because of the scale of it. So you just pick a light colour. So I've got basalt grey, neutral grey, pale grey blue. Those are the three grey colours I'm using for painting any of the black parts of the model. And I just paint them all the same way. So the bolt gun, the chainsword, and the gun holsters as well. And he's got some little packs on the back under his backpack. They're all painted black with these three grey colours on top for highlights. I just changed the texture a little bit. On the gun, the scratches are more kind of closely packed, and just pick out a few sort of subtle areas to make it look like there's dents and scratches in. On the chainsword here, you can see where I've done all the lines in the same direction, sort of kind of parallel, so it gives the impression that bits of debris have been kicked up and flown backwards due to the blades going round as they cut through things. And on the gun holster and the little, I guess they're leather packs that he has, again I've just left them black. If I wanted to spend more time on the model, I would have painted them leather and put all special little texture marks on them, but again it's just not worth it for the this sort of tabletop level stuff. So now I'm going to be spending this is kind of the most time consuming and the area where you really have to watch yourself to not spend too long on the model, and it's just picking out the the raised area to push the contrast and add some detail. If you want, you can actually skip this stage. You're not going to get as high contrast, so it's not going to pop as much when you look at it, and you know it won't have any sort of wow factor as such. But and if you just want to get things done very quickly, you can, like I said, just skip this stage. You've got everything sort of roughly highlighted and shaded. You've got all your guns done, all your metal trim done, so all the sort of vital parts of the model are filled in. This is just adding extra detail just to make things pop out, be high contrast, and catch people's attention. And all it is just looking at where you've originally placed the airbrush, so you can see all the texture that went onto the armor because of that sort of rough stippling effect that we did at the beginning. Well, that actually is really helpful. I know it looks awful when you first do it, and it does have a very, very slight raised effect on the armor, but that will kind of be hidden by the end of the process. But while you're doing all these little kind of edge highlights, and I'm going to be working on top of the light volumes a little bit as well, they sort of help to blend the marks in because they're already textured, so you don't have to do a perfectly smooth transition when you're painting on top of them. You can do little stipple marks and they blend in with the texture that's already on the model. You kind of see that as we progress. I'm using, so again, it's the three blues, the Macragge blue, Calgar blue, and blue horror. You don't, so on the wet palette you can't actually see any of the Macragge blue. That's more of a case of if you go a little bit wrong and you add too much of the Calgar blue, you can then use the Macragge blue as sort of a rubber to fix anything. But the two highlight colours are obviously Calgar blue and blue horror. So those are the same two colours that we airbrushed on. But because it was airbrushed on very sort of simply, even using just the Calgar blue, it will look like a highlight, apart from at the very brightest points where you went over the top with blue horror, because when you paint it on with your normal brush, as opposed to the airbrush, the Calgar blue will look more opaque, and because of the opacity of the paint, so some of the primer is still showing through in places, things like that. When you paint the more opaque colour on top, it'll look brighter, so it'll look like a highlight anyway. But as I said, so you're just looking for areas on the model. So here you can see, this is a great example, using the Calgar blue on the hip plate, and because it's like a thicker paint, it looks brighter than the when we airbrushed the Calgar blue already on there to start with. Then I just take a little bit of the blue horror as well. If you note, I'm not washing the brush off in between doing this, so it does help. It lets things blend a little bit on the model. Then just some very quick and simple stippling near the front of the armor plate, and it will, so you're creating like a stronger highlight, which then increases the contrast. And don't forget, there's going to be oil weathering at the end. So even at this stage where it's quite high contrast, it's not as high as it's going to be by the end of the video. It's also nice at this stage, just when picking out areas for highlights, if there's any areas that you feel like you missed with the airbrush, you can do the same thing. It's just a case of stippling. So because of that texture work, you can actually paint on top of areas and it'll blend in with the airbrushing because it's already got that kind of bitty look to it. Whereas if it was a perfectly smooth, so you hadn't done all the stippling at the beginning, you can't really match that look of paintwork very well with hand painting. You can get fairly close, but the airbrush does give a kind of a very specific look to the finish. Very, very smooth gradients and things like that. And it's a lot of time and effort to match that by hand. And if you make a mistake and you have to go over that, it's really hard to fix. Whereas because you have all this sort of texture effect on there now, stippling blends in really nicely. So you can actually cover up effects and faults on your paintwork really quite simply. Now, it's important as well at this stage to, again, not go over the top with the highlighting. This is purely just to pick out the focal points still, and it's increasing contrast, definition, just so that you can see quite clearly points on the model. As I said before, when I'm painting something, it's really hard for me not to spend time on an effort, making parts of the model look good when you're trying to do something for a tabletop. But the head on the model is somewhere where you can just spend that little bit of extra time if you have that urge where you want to, you just enjoy painting the models. I hardly ever get to finish enough models for gaming to have a fully painted force. The only time that I do that is when I paint Adeptus Titanicus type models, and that's because you don't need that many of them, but also the style of the painting means that I don't have to spend a long time on each model. But there are just little small areas where if I want to, I can just spend that little bit more time just to scratch that itch, if you like. Here you can see on the stomach that so I was talking about it, sometimes like there's a little area where you missed it with the airbrush or whatever when you were picking out some of the highlight points. So I didn't do any airbrushing on the stomach, where I probably should have. So all I had to do was go with the Calgar blue and just paint in like this little highlight point there, and it blends in quite well with the rest of the model. Don't forget, when you're looking at this is very heavily zoomed in. When you look at this on the actual accurate scale of the model, so when you're looking at it in your hand, even these texture marks are very, very tiny, almost invisible. So don't worry about that too much. And as I said, again, by the end of the video, they're going to be almost completely invisible because of the extra processes we're going to put on top. One of the nice little things that you can do as well, this is kind of like the fancy thing that people will look at when they see the video. Sorry, not the video, the model when they look at it, and they'll be like, "Oh, that's that looks really cool." That's the little shine points. Marines are fantastic for doing these. So the shoulder pads, head, and the little baubles on the backpack, they're designed for this, really. I think Games Workshop as well, they do the little shine points, but because they have such smooth painting, it's a bit harder to do those shine points cleanly. But because we've got the kind of the horrible looking texture effect, it's really easy just to stipple on these little shine points. You can see here the sort of scratchy marks I'm making, and it's going over the top of wherever the airbrush went. So the airbrush did a lot of the hard work to get a smooth transition, but you can paint on top of that just to push the contrast a little bit higher. And we are going to be going over that again at the end as well, just to really kind of keep that high contrast look. Here, for an even brighter dot on these shine points, I'm actually using some of the pale grey blue, which is the colour that I use for some of the edge highlights on the bolt gun and the chainsword. Be a little bit careful with adding this to the model. This is only for the very brightest points. I don't actually take anything up to white on the model. You can do, but it can get to a stage where you're actually adding too many highlights and it kind of looks a little bit weird. So just keep this for the very brightest focal points that you want to stand out. I think it's also important to note that so it looks like the paint is really thick with that kind of texture look. It's actually not, and if you wanted, you can spend a long time. You could paint this up to a display level, going over it with very thin layers, and that would actually hide a lot of this uneven looking surface. And when you put the varnish on at the end, that will also kind of naturally smooth everything out. sometimes people confuse really thick paint for like a texture effect, and they're not the same thing. If the paint is thin enough, you can work over the top of it without obscuring detail. So remember earlier on that I mentioned the gold trim, where which golds that I was going to highlight. This is where I'm using the gold from Vallejo, the metal colour gold. I've actually already done it on the right hand shoulder pad as we look at it. You can see how much sort of brighter and shinier it is than the Dwarven gold from scale 75. Be careful where you put this on the model. It's just a case of making it line up with the shine points on the shoulder pad, the blue shine points. Don't be too tempted to start adding highlights in dark areas or areas that it's just no point to doing it. Again, it's a tabletop model. It's just to get that high contrast look. Now, one of the annoying little detail parts on the model, if I was doing tabletop, like a whole army of these, ideally they wouldn't have these purity seals. I know they add to the background and the lore of the models, but it's one of these things where it just takes a little bit longer. It's only a small detail, but it does add quite a lot more time to the painting process. But I'm going to show you how to paint one pretty quickly anyway. So I'm just using some Mephiston red. I didn't even bother to paint these black to start with, so there's not that much blue on there. So it's just the raised areas that are blue. The recesses are all still black, so as long as you cover the flat surfaces, it's fine. You can still leave the darker areas and they'll just be a black outline anyway. And then I'm using some XV88 just to quickly layer over the flat surfaces, leaving a few little bits. It's quite thin paint as well. It's around about 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint. You can try 50-50. Each paint is a little bit different, so and that includes paints that are the same colour. So if you buy one pot and it works one way, and then you have a certain mix and you buy the next pot, it can still be a different consistency. There's always little minor variations in all sort of paint pots and things, especially because if you've used a paint for a long time, some of it will have evaporated. Then you buy a new pot, it's obviously a lot wetter. It's always best to experiment and test the paints before and don't just rely on a known mix that you've used before. Now I'm using some Ushabti bone. Again, just going over the XV88, but in smaller areas. There are some little ripples and things sculpted into these. So again, it's just picking those out. Now I'm using some black. I'm using scale 75 model colour black. It is my preferred black. Apparently there's a bit of a shortage of it at the moment, which is a bit of a disappointment, so I'm running quite low on that. But it's a nice colour to work with. It gives a very matte finish. It's quite smooth and gives good even coverage as well. So now I'm just going to paint in some very quick text. All I'm doing is kind of like little dots and dashes. Don't try and do anything too fancy. This is just something to do as quick as you can. A nice sharp point on your brush will make things a lot easier. Keep all the lines sort of roughly parallel. One of the nice things about this is you can make little blobs or tiny mistakes. It doesn't matter because then it will just look like large letters and things like that. Could be capital letters, could be long flowing letters, whatever. So again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but that was very, very quick just to do that. So at this stage, that's the majority of the painting done. I already think it looks pretty cool. Like if you wanted, you could just stop now. So if you don't want to use oil paints, that's fine. I've only just got into using oil paints. I mentioned Adeptus Titanicus before. I really wanted to give it a try with some oil weathering, and I kind of love the results for it, so I thought I'd try it on a marine and see if I can get something that looks dark and grimy, but some of the nice weathering effects anyway. So what I've done here is given the whole model a coat of gloss varnish. I use some Vallejo. It's Mecha Varnish. It seems to airbrush quite nicely. It doesn't have, but like any gloss varnish will be fine. And a nice little thing to do at this stage as well is also add any decals or transfers that you have, because the model's already glossed, and so the decals will go on much more nicely. I've just had them sitting in some water for a little while. Then I'm using my pliers to kind of prod them and get them into roughly the right position. It's always easy to do this while they're nice and wet. I know a lot of people have problems with transfers with the raised surfaces and things. So you look at that and you think, wow, those look terrible. They're all, they're not going to dry flat. You're right, they're not going to dry flat. So I've just waited for it to dry down. I actually use a hairdryer. So it's actually not too bad how they've dried on the model. But now I'm just using some microset, and so you can get two things for this. You can get microsol and microset. Microsol just sort of softens the transfer, so you can kind of more easily put it into place on a difficult looking surface. But you don't really need it. It's the microset that is the important one. So you just kind of give them a coat, and then you leave it. And so I left. Now, ideally, you will leave it for, at this stage, around about 20 minutes or 30 minutes, something like that. But I was kind of like in a rush to get this done. So, I used a hairdryer to speed up the process to make it dry. Then with a cotton bud, this is quite like an important stage, and I think a lot of people miss this out. So the film has already started to break down with the microset. So now all you have to do is roll a cotton bud over it. And this will remove any air bubbles or creases, things like that. It pushes it out from the side. And you'll see as you push them out, it will kind of push any of the fluid and things that are underneath as well. It gives a very, very flat finish. It's important that you roll it though. Don't push it. That will dislodge and damage the transfer. So it's already dried at this stage. I would strongly recommend that you leave it for a good few hours. I didn't, and I left it for, 10 minutes after airbrushing it. Hair drying it. So you can get better results than this. And if you want, you can give it another quick layer of microset just to make sure it's completely stuck to the model. But regardless, after that, give it a coat of gloss varnish. Leave that to dry. Again, you can use the hairdryer to speed up the process. And then we're going to give it an oil wash. This is the kind of the fun, messy bit. So this is like real oil paints. If you've seen some of my other stuff where I've talked about water-soluble oil paint, this isn't the same. This is like actual oil paint. So you want to make sure that, one, you don't lick your brush. This has been the hardest thing for me because I tend to lick my brush a lot. And two, don't stick it in your water jar. It's not going to clean it. Once you've got those parts out of the way, it's just the same as painting normally. So I took the black and the burnt sienna, mixed them together. If you had burnt umber, that'll do the job as well. I just didn't, so I mixed up a close enough equivalent. And I've used Sansador with the paint to turn it into this wash. You can see, so I'm just covering the whole model. Try not to flood it. You want a good coat on there, so it does cover the whole model, but don't do it so it pools around the base or anything like that. Then we're going to go back and take a cotton bud. Can be the same one that you used to roll over on the transfers with, and all you're doing is just going to pick off the excess oil paint from the highlighted areas. So this is anywhere where you've worked with the highlights, specifically the airbrush areas as well. So there's the knee, shoulder pads, head, that hip plate, the backpack with the little round globes, Also on the back of the leg as well, there's some big curves, like big obvious areas that have a bit more highlight, areas where you've spent more time on it. I would say it's probably easier to dab the model than rubbing it like I'm doing here. What I did find with rubbing it was that I tended to leave a couple of little strands of cotton fibre behind. They'll get caught on the model. It's a bit irritating because we're going to give it another varnish afterwards, and then that seals those onto the model, so you have to spend a bit of time picking those off. Another thing you can actually do is just take some pure Sansador that's not had any oil paint on it, and dab a bit of that on a brush, then dry it off a bit, but then you can rub off the highlight points as well. It'll push the oil paint away from those highlighted areas. But there you can see, so this is a very kind of grimy looking marine now. Now I'm going to be giving him a coat of Ultramatte Varnish. I'm using Ultramatte by MIG, and it gives, like, as it says on the front of it, Ultramatte. It's a very, very matte finish. It gives a fantastic look. Now it's at this stage where all of that texture that was on the model has kind of sort of vanished. Like, it is still there, but it's very hard to see because the light is now diffused over the model because of that matte varnish. So now I'm going to very quickly paint in an eye, or rather you're going to see me paint part of an eye in. What I discovered when I checked the footage was that it was like this. It was out of focus, and it just wasn't worth showing. So there's going to be quite a big skip. Also, I I did such a bad job of painting it. I'm holding at the model at a slightly difficult angle for me to paint, just so that you can kind of see it, and with it being out of focus, I just thought it wasn't worth showing that much. But just to quickly say how I'm doing it, so this is how Games Workshop paint eyes. This is how everyone paints Space Marine eyes. It's just a case of taking a red colour, or whatever colour you want, doing a transition from black at the back to a light colour at the front. I've started with Mephiston red because Ultramarines have red eyes. That's lenses rather, not the human eyes. And you just paint. So you paint the transition. So I've gone to Wild Rider red. That will then go at the front. And you try and paint a small lower edge highlight going all the way around. Then I've mixed some Ushabti bone in. There's no special reason for using Ushabti bone. I just used that because it was close by to mix a lighter colour in with the Wild Rider red. So you paint a little bit of that at the front, a little lower edge, all the way around, and then a white dot right at the back of the eye where the black section is. And then you get that nice sort of high contrast, shine point. You can see here another little mess up by me. I was going to paint a little white highlight at the very front of the eye as well, just to push that contrast still again, and I managed to catch some of the edge of the helmet. So you can see, anyone can mess up painting eyes there, but it is worth spending that little bit of time on the face, as I said earlier in the video. But it's just unfortunate for when I was recording it that it didn't pick it up very well. So now these are just going to be some final touches. Again, if you're happy with the model at this stage, then by all means stop now. This is just me with my kind of desire to push the model a bit further, just to increase the contrast and make it look a little bit fancy. So again, going back to the same colours that we had before. So the highlight colours were Calgar blue and blue horror, and I'm also taking it up to the pale grey blue that we had kept on the weapons for highlights as well. And it's basically just doing exactly the same thing as you did before the oil wash, but keeping it in a much smaller size. So really you don't want to be spending much time on this at all, and it's just to make the highlight points pop out, because even though we went back with the cotton bud to rub off some of the oil wash that had gone over the highlights, it still kind of gave a very soft filter over all the highlights and dulled them down. So we're going back with the same colours again, just to make those areas pop out a little bit now. So you can do these little dots on any kind of edge, but especially on the areas that you'd already worked on. The oil wash actually will have helped to create a softer transition on any of the highlights as well. So, there's no real need to spend any time, working on transitions as such. The only slight area that was a bit annoying was here, where the transfer had gone over the highest shine point on the shoulder, really. So I just had to kind of tweak that a little bit so I could still see the shine at the front there. And it's, again, exactly the same process, just stippling, just very fine stippling. This is kind of like busy work. Like, as I said, for a tabletop thing, you shouldn't really be doing this, but this is just, just me being me. Also, you can go back on the face a little bit, just pick out the lower edges on the eye sockets. Again, this pushes the contrast. It'll actually make the eyes pop out a little bit more because it's framing them, and they have a black recess going all the way around, so this, it makes them stand out really quite nicely. And then we can go to the pale grey blue. Again, this is the highest highlight, so it's not messing up by being the same brightness as the transfers. You can go up to white if you want, but it's really pushing the brightness of the contrast. But anyway, that's the end of the painting on the Marine now. I actually think that looks quite cool. It took me roughly like 2.5 hours, I think, to paint. But a lot of that time will be due to waiting for things to dry, and I did rush through a bit with the transfers as well. So there's a few areas that are rushed, a few areas where I spent a bit too long. But it's mainly because I'm only painting one model. Whereas if you're doing this for an army, I would strongly recommend that you paint these in a batch of at least 5. Then that way, you make really good progress, and it'll work. Things will dry while you're working on another model. But anyway, here's the finished piece. I think it looks pretty cool for a tabletop piece. And that's the end of the process. You can see here on the 360. I didn't show you how to do the base because it's basically just sand glued to the base. Paint it black and dry brush it. You can use whatever color you want for your the bases on your models. And then I used some dark sand on weathering powder from Forge World, and I just, as you saw there on the video, just kind of scrunched that into the boots. You can set that if you want to put some matte varnish over it. However, it will kill the weathering powder a bit, and I think it's unlikely that you're going to be picking up the model by its feet. You probably use the edge of the base or whatever. So really, I don't see any point to putting any varnish over the top just to set it or anything. And just having that bit of weathering powder there helps to kind of ground the model onto the base and make it look part of the environment as well. But anyway, so that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you very much for watching. So if you enjoyed the content, please subscribe. There'll be a lot more videos coming to YouTube in the future. But also, if you want to paint models up to like display standard, or if you have any interest in Golden Demon and painting up to that kind of thing, then I do have a website and Patreon where I go into more detail on high quality display type pieces, and all the links will be in the description below. But thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.